everybody, and even if you don't have a body. Welcome back to The Integral Stage. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is the third episode in a rotating multi-podcast conversation between myself, John Vervaeke, and Graham Dempsey. If you haven't seen the first one on Voices with Vervaeke or the second one on the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, I urge you to check those out. And I'm not going to do too much personal introduction here because it's covered there. I will give my sense of where we are in this conversation and what I think the stakes are. And then I'll turn it over to my friends and fellow dialogos participants to say hi and provide their own situating, and then we'll let the spirit unfold itself between us. So where are we? Apparently, this is the planet Earth. We're facing a confluent set of accumulating potentially radical crises and opportunities, whose choke point is something like a meaning crisis and or an educational crisis. And one important subset of that is that we need to think through and get leverage over the possibility of new quasi-religious institutions and networks that might be able to scale up the promulgation of a science-friendly, philosophically informed, spiritually serious ecology or ecologies of wisdom cultivation. So we've been talking about the difficulties a project like that would face, the principles that would have to be involved, the potential types of processes and structures that would need to be employed, and ways to imagine the various communities and languages and developmental styles that would have to be adaptively accounted for in such a project. And last time we focused on trust, both in terms of what are trustworthy sources of wisdom and also how one exchanges trust signals with different types of people and communities and contexts. We left off, if I remember correctly, considering the possibility of looking for some similarities and convergences between types of adaptive layered processing and evolving intelligence structures that occur in nature, notably in the extended neurobehavioral cognitive space of human beings, and on the other hand, the history of religious networks, institutions, and processes. Where do they resemble each other? If we were thinking of setting up a process-based wisdom institution, how would it embody natural intelligence procedures? And would that almost necessarily resemble whatever we think are good historical and contemporary examples of spirit and maturation projects? So I find that very exciting. My pondering on this topic has been really intrigued by different kinds of ways of thinking about the reciprocal adaptive interface layers in which a person or a system or an institution has to bring in some of their anticipations about wisdom work and also receive patterning from situations and then resolve discrepancies and highlight good approximate fits. So that's the part I'm really feeling into. But let's get a snapshot from my fellow contemplative friends about where they feel we are at the beginning of this dialogue. John, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, thank you, Layman, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to continue on this discussion. I don't have too much to add to what Layman just did because I thought it was fantastic and exemplary. Yeah, the proposal that Layman talked about at the end of his summary is what I'd like to really zero in on. What are some of the features of systems that are intelligent and or capable of significant evolutionary change? So not the evolution of a trait, but the evolution of evolvability. Because I think part of what we're trying to do here in shifting the model is analogous to something that's going on in biology, where they're now moving. Well, it's not like replacing. In addition to the older older normal kinds of discussions about the evolution of traits, there's a new discussion about the evolution of evolvability itself as kind of a meta trait that helps to explain the rapidity at which evolutionary change can occur, and that this is something that might be relevant for our particular environment. That meta trait is relevant in which there's been rapid environmental change, as you can, I think, sort of intuitively understand, and it drives acceptation faster, et cetera, et cetera. And since it's a plausible proposal that we are in a period of tremendous acceleration in terms of the impact of technologies and the amount of information being presented to us and the complexification of both the technology and the information sphere, I think we should be thinking about something analogous to the evolution of evolvability in the religion that's not a religion, if I can just use that as a catch-all phrase. I mean, not specific to what I'm talking about, but related, but more general. And that's the thing I think that upon reflection, I think that's how I'd want to make a more precise proposal about how we're trying to do something different from what Layman Pascal beautifully called the old world religions. And how do we incorporate that into sort of novel organizational structures is something I hope we can discuss to some degree today. So that's sort of in addition to what Layman said, that's sort of a specification of where I'd like to zero in. And I understand that the old world religions had an advantage in that, and Paul van der Klee is very good on this, the politics is about now and religion is about always, and that therefore its rate of change should be different. I think that has to be acknowledged, and that's why you tend to get, institutions that are very conservative in a certain kind of way. And then the question is whether that adaptive feature is now currently more relevant, or if it is, how do we incorporate it in with the new demand for evolvability as being a primary requirement, I would argue, for the accelerating change that we're being subjected to. So I'll now pass that over to Brendan.
Great. Yeah. So not much to add to that other than to, I suppose, emphasize the artful in the artful scaling, which is where I'm kind of leaning into the conversation. I think a lot of great theoretical ideas are coming up in this conversation, and I'll sort of continually be wanting to sort of orient those towards then cultural production and see the ways that these get embedded and embodied and instantiated in actual cultural artifacts that then people are interacting with and doing that sort of interface work with, because that's sort of, in my mind, where the rubber meets the road. And so the way that production work interfaces with aesthetics and art in general, and the different sort of generic forms of art is something that I'm really interested in, and would love to see how, as we're kind of dancing from theory to practice, or kind of theory to inaction, to try to see how these things can kind of interweave. And so, yeah, that's sort of my little coin to throw into the pot here.
Yeah, I appreciate that element, Brendan. And what I first thought of when you said that was the Celtic Christianity, right? The Celtic cross that adds the circle to it, and the beautiful, the Lindisfarne manuscripts and things like that. Those are glorious aesthetic examples of cultural history. Do they reflect moments when religious institutions were behaving more like these adaptive structures? And it may not be the case that religion is always homogeneously conservative. It may be that it's a fluctuating terrain in which a lot of the moments in which the most beautiful and interesting elements of religion appeared in world history were the moments in which it was learning to learn faster, evolving its evolvability in ways that we could carry forward. Mm-hmm. So it may not be that we're changing religion fundamentally. It may be that we're sort of capturing and recollecting the moments when it was doing its job the best historically, and those are often moments where the art is a signpost to the fact that it was successful.
I think that's right. I think that the challenge that we face is artists. It's kind of cliched at this point, but artists are often considered, that vanguard cultural force that's sort of pushing into new territory. And we don't know exactly the landscape that we're entering. So we don't know what that kind of surplus coherence, to use your language, really looks like yet. But I think that is the domain that artists can be and should be exploring, with the toolkit and with the framework of these great theoretical tools that we're using, and that, John and Layman, both of you have kind of theorized. I feel like this is sort of the project, as I conceive of it, is taking that theoretical knowledge and now trying to apply the best of our understanding about adaptive processes and evolution, and even the evolution of evolution, and applying that to to what's coming next. And it is an exploratory act, I suppose, because again, we're trying to feel it out, as it were. And it's, in this sense, it is sort of a kind of adaptive thing in itself. Not every meme that goes out into the world is going to survive or thrive, but certain ones will. And so I see this as sort of part of a broader cultural project, at which artists, could be standing at that vanguard and sort of exploring this terrain and putting out different materials that could speak to a highly contemporary, spiritual sensibility, a religious sensibility that fits in our world. And not all those are going to work. So it's sort of a trial and error sort of process. And it's also a co-creative symbiotic process where, this emerged over here and we can kind of, develop this here. And so I don't want to, go too far down that rabbit hole, but that's what I'm most intrigued and excited about, is thinking about this project as a sort of broad cultural aesthetic endeavor in which we are aiming towards that coherence by means of experimentation and artistic production, and that is sort of the organic process out of which whatever this religion that's not a religion, whatever its sort of mythos is going to emerge.
Well, maybe there's a topic then I could introduce for discussion around what's been said here. So one of the features of sort of evolvability has to do with solutions by Wagner and Gilbert around the robustness problem. So the robustness problem for biological systems are, you need a lot of variation in the species in order for evolution to work. If there's very little variation, evolution proceeds very slowly. Problem is, you don't want to be the organism that is the variation, because chances are you're just going to die, right? And so how do you resolve that paradox? And what has been proposed, and then this goes towards some very strangely convergent stuff from machine learning, is what's called degeneracy. I hate this term. It's going to mislead the general public just all over the place. They need to come up with a better term. But the idea is, what you have is you have a lot of, and within the genotype, you have a lot of variation, but it's not, it's a bunch, here's a variation, then it overlaps with this variant. And so there's a lot of overlapping. So there's a lot of redundancy. And what it is all of that allows for various sort of canceling out effects so that the variations don't make any phenotypical difference, right? So there's quite a bit of genotypical variation, but there's no huge difference in the phenotype. So the organism isn't immediately being killed off, but the variation is there. And then the idea is when the environment shifts, what happens is you have a pre-adaptation that's sort of ready to go, that's easily exacted and then made the primary sort of genotype. And that's how you start all over again. You started getting this balance between letting the organism be sort of specifically fit to its environment, but having a lot of reserve of variation within the genotype. And it seems to me, and I thought we were to some degree moving towards that, because we were trying to get, an ecology of institutions that have different sort of, modus operandi, and yet there's in some kind of, they're linked in some opponent self-correcting fashion, and there's something there. But the idea is, it seems to me that one of the things that art could contribute is exactly that mediation, because it's a tricky mediation. It would be, how do we introduce, if you'll allow me to use these as analogs, how do we introduce a lot of genotypic variation in the ecologies of practices and how people are coming into this, and Layman's talked about also a pluralism of worldviews, etc., developmental stages. How do we encourage that while also maintaining a kind of phenotypical stability with respect to the environment that they're in, so that the institution has the ability to persist and remain and start to address the always. So it's always addressing the always through its persistence, but it's got this, bank of, again, I don't like this term, degeneracy, ready to go so that it can quickly adapt when needed. And it seems to me that is a particular task of mediation that art might be precisely the most proper tool for addressing. How do you introduce variation at the genotypical level, but while maintaining sort of a phenotypical constancy? I hope that made sense.
Yeah. I would want to throw in a thought there where, we were sort of playing around briefly with the idea of these institutions sort of having this checks and balances system built into it. And if you consider sort of like the idea of an American Constitution, for example, it is the notion that if this doesn't keep working, it should be changed. It's built into the institution, its own modification itself. And what you're saying reminds me of that a bit. And it would seem to require a institutional framework where the understanding of whatever the mythos is not fixed, but that's what is fixed about it. And so that creates that stability factor, so that there's not just a series of revolutions, as it were, to use kind of the political metaphor here with the religious, but that there's an underlying stability that has built in the very notion of adaptation and change to fit emerging realities. And so I feel like that would be an important component of this religion that's not a religion, that Daniel Gortz talks about the idea of the headless God, which is sort of this notion that the notion of the the sacred, as it were, sort of is understood as a basis to be an evolving thing. And I feel like this is part of where the challenge comes in with some of that rigid, overly conservative, traditional religious institutions comes in, because it sets a fixed orthodoxy that is sort of then unable to be moved or shifted or changed. The sort of fixed canon that then, as conditions change, it becomes increasingly untenable, and then you see a meaning crisis. So if you have built into the institutions a shared understanding that the God will, and the notion of the headless God is the idea that sort of God is continually dying and being reborn or having his head cut off, that this is sort of a continual process that needs to take place. But if you build that into the system, it's not kind of traumatic and upsetting and destabilizing. It's part of the natural sort of organism of the institution itself to be facilitating that change and that development. And that would be arguably where the creative arts would be fulfilling the function as individuals kind of participate in the process of exploring that terrain and that territory and putting new material out there and allowing, within the stability of those institutions, new forms to arise and a new mythos to take shape. I don't know if that lands for anyone, but I feel like that's a really important idea behind all of this.
It does.
Yeah, it's interesting story, John. Art naturally plays that role, I think, because the motifs of the art set a consistency that's passed through time intergenerationally within these things, right? Like the image of Christ on the cross or the image of the meditating Buddha. These are passed along, and art simultaneously produces new seed forms that could lead down new pathways if we needed it to. So I think it always does that mediating role between the expansive adaptive form and the conservative form, but that could be made a lot more explicit within institutions. Right. And then how would you instantiate that? You'd need it to be part of the constitution of the institution to some degree. But I think you'd also need to make sure that the people, that artists themselves were sufficiently represented within those institutions.
Yeah.
So that the mindset of the creative person, it has a say within that process.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's it's almost like the artist would have to have like an equivalent role to the priest or the minister or whatever that role is, or the abbot or whatever. I think that's a point that comes out. And then I think picking up on what Layman just said and saying what you're saying, Brendan, like the symbol of the headless God is an example of exactly this, right? That's an artistic production. It's not a philosophical argument. It's not a theoretical construct, right? It's an image that allows people, one of the important functions of symbols is it allows people to hold things in mind that otherwise are very difficult to hold in mind because they are abstract or they're vague or they're inchoate or they're in flux. And right, but the point, what I like about the symbol, Daniel's symbol, is an attempt to give people, as Layman said, a motif of continuity and that's the phonotypical stability. But it also explicitly makes, right, a call to a lot of multiple interpretations of this. So the sort of genotypical variation, so that, and let's be clear, this was always the case. Like Christ on the cross, like the interpretations that people have of that, of Jesus, like they're like this, right? The trick is to let this vary but overlap. Because if it just varies without overlap, then the system, then the organism just dies, right? The organisms outside of one specific genotype just die, right? So I think I would like to point to the important integration of these explicitly generated symbols, and then also the faculty of the imaginal, that has to also, I think, be made more explicit, and what its role is going to be for people. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I like the idea of the headless God, how it points to what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is a practice itself that can be worked into these ecologies of practice, basically. Yes. The artistic symbolic construction of the mythos, understood and conceived of as a constructed mythos, but one that is necessarily adapting and forced to adapt at an ever increasing rate, it seems. And so, if it is true, and I think it is, that our society is accelerating in its level of technological and having this destabilizing effect of, we don't have the stability, sort of long-term stability that existed in pre-modern and in traditional societies, where whatever that religion that's not a religion is going to look like would seem to need to work within a quickly evolving, highly adaptive context. And this would seem to do precisely that. It also avoids some of the narrative reification problems, I think. It's not immune to them, because it's not inconceivable to imagine people bowing down and worshiping a headless God, and that might be an interesting kind of notion to consider of what further mechanisms could be introduced to avoid that sort of that literalization of symbols, which seems to be its own kind of, perennial problem, to use a phrase, in religious contexts. But in this sense, anyway, if you built in I don't know if this would be its own institution or would work cross or inter-institutionally, but the sort of, or if it would actually even work kind of moment by moment, context by context, in a sort of pastoral pedagogical way of sort of symbol construction, symbol creation to meet the needs of continually evolving moments, with the stable understanding that these things are speaking to, they're speaking symbolically to ideas, and therefore shouldn't be reified as sort of absolute truths. But the main point there is just that within these ecologies or practices, this is the one that for me definitely speaks to my heart, certainly the most. And I feel like it's a great way of incorporating and integrating the artistic endeavor itself within sort of the theology of the religion that's not a religion, rooted in an established understanding of necessary adaptation and continued evolution of the mythos itself.
So I'm wondering if we could incorporate that into the generation of the images and the symbols. Like, there have been examples of this, of dynamic sort of wiki construction of a symbol, where you have, and people are introducing variation and individually and then collectively, and then so you have a constantly evolving thing, and there's a continuity, and there's also a continuity of participation and going on. But there's lots of variations, and the variations can be exploited and explored as are needed in the change. And then people could also take still photos at various stages if they thought something was particularly beautiful or worth preserving, and you could get some sort of combination of individual and collective and static and dynamic generation of these symbols. which might go towards helping them in the very technological formatting to exemplify the stuff we're talking about right here.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to leverage the current technological options that our ancestors didn't have.
Yes.
That sense of people highlighting the moments in that process, I think, is really important, because one thing that's implicit to all of this that we haven't really been talking about so much is the way that layering is a feature of this.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? We've got to, even with the issue of art, there has to be somebody there, for example, within an institution to both encourage art, but also hold it back a little bit. So there's different ways of conceiving these layers, but we have to be thinking of like adaptive interface layers that reflect upon each other in order to maximize the, evolution of evolvability.
Yeah, one of the challenges that as I've been exploring these ideas with folks and are trying to articulate some of these possibilities is the possibility of, I guess, sort of a runaway fragmentation, right? If our goal here is in some ways an integration and coherence of some kind, I always hear the kind of feedback, well, wouldn't everyone just sort of invent their own thing and then no one would really have any basis for shared understanding? Which I think is a legitimate concern, but I also feel that, again, the symbols themselves are both, they serve a kind of function narratologically, but they also serve a praxeological function in the sense that the very generation of them is community building and community structuring and orienting. And it's very hard to sort of deify a symbol that you were involved in its construction, right? There's sort of an understanding that whatever you're symbolizing is transcending the symbol by the very fact that you're, kind of instantiating it. I would argue, and so I feel like this is a great way in which a lot of these the kind of challenges of necessary quick-paced adaptation mixed with our new technological environment can sort of come together to work out an efficacious community of a self-generating sort of symbol set, and that this sort of seems to be a great way too. We've considered how these institutions would be working, whether they'd be material or digital or what have you. I mean, this is a way of basically really essentially a dispersed planetary open source religion to function. And I feel like there's at least a lot of promise there. For me, then the question is, as you were saying, Layman, like, what are who are those regulators of integration that are going to keep this whole thing, or it doesn't have to be people either. It could be constitutions, as it were, or constructs, sets of rules, sets of community standards. But who's going to kind of keep this thing, moving along, and what are sort of the telltale hallmark signs that this is working effectively and not just sort of, kind of exploding into fragmentation? I mean, John, I know you talk a lot about the dangers of autodidacticism and people sort of doing their own thing. And so there's a way in which that could be sort of folded in here, but it kind of needs to also be kept on the rails, as it were. And that's sort of something that would require, I think, kinds of institutions and regulator functions to be at play.
I think it's important to think of regulators as going in both directions a little bit, right? A regulator has to be able to slow something down or keep it on the rails. They also have to be able to encourage it to go forward. Like I had this experience the other day where I'm making a coffee and I put a little bit of honey in. It wasn't very much, but it was too much. I thought, I already decided for myself that unless I feel like it's not quite enough, then it's the wrong amount. Like if I put not quite enough honey in, that's the perfect amount of honey. If I'm satisfied with the amount, it's always too much. Right. And this is an idea I've already had. So it's an emerging subtle insight, but my behavior has not absorbed this. I've had this idea for a year and I've only acted on it once or twice. So I have another frame of mind that goes, what are you, a fool? Why don't you enact your actual insight? Right. And then collectively, we need people like that. We need people to say, look, actually try this, actually instantiate this, right? Go ahead, try this, make a new version of it. Because sometimes people need encouragement. Sometimes they need to be moved away from their tendency to conform to the established system, and other times they need the exploding plurality of options to be constrained a little bit. So whether it's the structure of the system itself, whether it's individuals or whatever it is, it has to be able to negotiate back and forth, a little more, a little less. Yeah, go ahead and try that. Okay, don't get carried away with that. Just like any parent does with a child.
That's very good. Okay, I'm just going to start on something because it's resonating, and then hopefully it will gel. Like I was hearing or seeing the possibility of some kind of non-propositional isomorphism, or at least para-isomorphism, between the evolution of these pictorial, let's say, images, or perhaps they're auditory, like music, progression music or something like that, right? And then the kind of stuff that happens in dialogos. And I'm wondering if what the regulators should also do is like taking a page from Nora Bateson's notebook, is that they would circulate between practices, where people are doing dialogos and where people are doing, I don't know what to call this, the evolving the image, evolving the symbol, the wiki evolution of the symbol or something. And part of what they would have to do would be train a sensibility of resonance and dissonance between those and explicate them and speak them out. And perhaps that would be the signal that is then used for more of this, less of that, slow this down, speed that up kind of thing. Like we'd need to have, they'd almost have to be sort of meta artists, right? They'd have to cultivate a sensibility of moving between these and sensing dissonance and resonance. So they can say, hey, the dialogos and the jazzing of the hymns and the wikiing of the images, these are going really, really well. I can sense they're really resonating from each other. They're mutually pollinating each other. Or wait, this is getting cacophonous. We're getting out of sync with each other. We need to slow down. We need to look for some commonality, like that. That sounds to me like that's a new kind of role that I don't see in any of the, at least explicitly in any. I'm sure it's there latently, so I don't want to be too overgeneralized, but it's generally not explicit within some of the old world religions. But it would be, I think, enormously facilitatory of what you're talking about, Layman. I'm trying to think of like the signal. What signals are they picking up on for get back on the rails or speed things up? And what kind of sensibilities and skills do they have to have in order to do this? And those might be also analogous at a higher level or layer to the people that are circulating between the church, the monastery, and the university, as we call them. And again, when are they resonant and when are they dissonant from each other? Does that make sense as a proposal?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the interesting thing about the possibility of setting up something like that, meta-religious, intra-religious, quasi-religious consultancy and adaptive intervention group is that it can work with seemingly secular forms. It could work with people who are trying to set up new systems. It could also work with existing systems. They could go in and say, if they were asked to, here we have Sufi Islam, or we have a local Hindu church or something like that, and we would love your feedback on what we're doing too much of or not enough of. How is what we're doing operating relative to your understanding of what the set of wisdom practices and wisdom principles are, because we trust you to be able to do that negotiation and to do it adaptively in a way that takes how we want to do it seriously. And because we want to know where we're going a little too far or where we're not going far enough, so that we can be more empowered and better, as long as we don't think you're just trying to sell us on your thing. So that a system like that could be very flexible, because we do have to imagine that most people are already embedded in something that they think of as a religion.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, you named it, Layman, with the trust thing, which I feel like is where this kind of comes back into all of this, is sort of who has this sort of what's the word? Something like moral authority, but that for me has all these negative baggage connotations for whatever reasons. But teacher, great, perfect. Who has the teacherly authority exactly? And finding that being established in a trust framework where it's not, because also a lot of critique that I hear when these sorts of topics are raised, it's like, oh, you just want to invent your own cult, wouldn't you like to just be a cult leader or something? There's this suspicion, and it's a good one, I think, that people should be wary of these sorts of things, which kind of brings in that dark side element too, to be kind of ever present. But that if there is a trust factor there, that this is someone who's cutting through the bullshit, this is someone engaged in dialogos, this is someone engaged in a good faith effort with this co-creative process, and is sort of operating, yes, with teacherly authority, that would be, I think, a solid foundation for sort of playing that kind of what would essentially be sort of a moderator role, if you think about the equivalence of like a Facebook forum or something like that, of trying to facilitate and excite and evoke people's own creative engagement, rather than, and I think this is a great way in which it's both a top down, but also it's a top down in service of a bottom up engagement. And you're bringing in all these new ideas and new efforts. And I think at the very least, I mean, it's a one way that symbols could get unstuck. Right. I mean, there's this pervasive issue where so much of what is sort of goes for religion is sort of express your belief in this symbol set and then you're good. Right. But the very fact that the symbols are brought into adaptation, change, co-creative, development is I think something that can, get those gears kind of going again and start bringing out what we would think of as more genuine forms of spiritual engagement with the symbols, rather than just sort of a kind of classic membership identity and assertion of orthodoxy or something like that.
I do think that making this kind of like I said, wiki generated, I'm sure there's a better way of talking about it, but that's good enough for now, will help. Because you're not going to get a single ownership or authority. And I would say that one of the things, I feel like we're like Clown in the Republic or something. One of the things we would want from the moderators is, clear evidence of enjoying a sensibility that enjoys the aesthetics of the resonance or the dissonance for its own sake, that they're amateurs in the proper meaning of the word. They love it, and they love the beauty, and they love to reduce the noise and increase the beauty. And there's going to be variations, and that role of recognizing the resonance and the dissonance doesn't have to itself carry with it immediate authority. They could be sort of honored advisors, and then they would advise the people in charge of the university and the church and the monastery, and say, what you people know, and this goes towards Layman's point, you people here, know better how the internal guts of this work, but you're out of sync with these, or the dialogos. People are generating all these images in the dialogos that are not being taken up in the wiki image, or vice versa. The wiki image is doing all this evolution, and the dialogos is not seeming to pay attention to it like that. So, we can, this is again, the separation of powers. This is only trustworthiness. There's no final solution to these problems, but, looking for people who have a particular sensibility for this. They really enjoy, like, I really love it when I can see the image and the progressive music and the dialogos and the Lectio Divina, when they're all gelling. That's so beautiful. Like Plato talks about that in the Symposium, being able to rise to that level of beauty and appreciate it and love it for its own sake. And I think that could go a long way towards those two things, having the distributed generation and also having people as the moderators do it because of the aesthetic love of the process. That could go a long way to alleviating the concerns. Like I said, there's nothing anybody can design that will prevent those things from possibly happening, but we can reduce. I would suggest those would reduce the probability of them happening.
Yeah, it's like being a good gardener, right? You have to really, even if you're going to weed something out, you have to basically be in love with plants and with fertility and with growth and all those things, right? If we want to emphasize a trend toward learning to learn or evolvability, then we have to favor, whether it's a type or a skill or a level, whatever it is, the moderators have to have certain characteristics.
Yes.
And those characteristics have to be like two-way characteristics. They have to be able to output, which is to say, look, our map of wisdom practices and principles predicts that maybe this is missing or maybe this is missing. But they also have to be receptive and go, wow, I love what you guys have done here. I especially love that one. I love all of them. And in fact, maybe you have something to tell us that isn't in our map of wisdom skills. So it's got to have that negotiative thing. And in the degree to which they understand that negotiative membrane, then they are a little bit higher in whatever the organic hierarchy of knowing and being in this process is, because they have more clarity on the interface that is where the learning occurs. And we want to favor learning to learn. So we have to privilege people who have more salient awareness of what those interactions are like and the fact of their two-wayness.
That's awesome. A couple of things are coming up for me on this. One is to tie back in Layman's thought of where do we see religion working effectively, and how can we use some of those processes in this process. And for me, I see this dynamic as having been one that's played out historically and been played out in ways that are let's say salutary. I mean, if you think of, say, just as an example, like all right, let me make a distinction though. So there's always been this taking up of symbols, reforming them, refashioning them, developing them. I think one of the differences is that in the past, in the old world religion sort of model, there was always then the imposition of whatever has now been developed is sort of retroactively imagined that this has always been what the symbol has said, right? Like if you think about what Plotinus did with Plato, developed a lot, but then it was sort of like, oh, but this is what Plato was saying the whole time. And so it sort of becomes this thing. The difference here is that it's sort of made explicit, it's owned. And I think that is helpful at the very least. But two, this leads me into wanting to ask the questions of, okay, if we've established sort of, let's call it a genre in which this is playing out, then I think the question of content becomes important. And this is where kind of this notion of bringing in, okay, well, we have the theoretical elements and we can see these sorts of things, and maybe we can recognize this is missing or that's missing, and trying to draw that out then of this process. But where I'm really fascinated then is like how can we take some of the ecologies of practices and the theoretical concepts, say, for instance, John, that you've articulated, and symbolize them, right? To give them symbolic form and allow them to stand and be engaged with in that sort of pictorial or auditory form that lends them then both a facility of use, amends them or opens them up for co-adaptation, and also it renders them poetic. It renders them aesthetic in a way that kind of takes them from the realm of the rational and the mental, and kind of it breathes some beauty into them. And so for me, then the question is that translation process. Basically, how do we translate these ideas into symbols? And I'd love to actually just try to explore some of that, if not now, then at some other point. But I think that would be a really fascinating sort of assignment, as it were, an experiment to see how well that could be accomplished. And
well, I'd like to highlight or a certain chunk of the Zen tradition in this discussion, because Zen is very interesting in that it's highly aesthetic. They're using art, and they're using it specifically to instantiate principles, right? The Zen garden is not just beautiful. It's meant to tell you something about yourself and consciousness and wisdom evolution. They are doing a process whereby you take your insights to a person believed to be a moderator of those insights, and you have a feedback exchange. And what you're training to do is, with the koans in particular, is not just be able to have transformative experiences with them, which is hugely important, but to be able to output them as well. So they're training you to be innovative producers of new Zen, which is important in terms of learning to learn. And they also have this process instantiated in the koans, which is they capture bits of dialogue and they preserve those bits of dialogue in an increasingly stylized form over history. So there's this way in which particular instantiations of wisdom skills are being turned into an art form by capturing highlighted bits of the dialogue itself. And so these are some very beautiful, interesting factors of a situation in which we might say religion was really working for a while there.
That's very cool, because so let's do what you propose. Let's take that and then let's look at an emerging thing, because an emerging thing that has some of those qualities to it is the whole meaning wave genre that's emerging, where they're taking, they'll take a passage where somebody's speaking or a dialogue, and then they put music to it, and then they'll repeat certain phrases with echo, and then they'll have color, and so like the meaning wave phenomena is sort of taking off, and it's doing something similar. It's trying to take, right. It's like you said, it's trying to do this sort of salience landscaping of an existing dialogue, and then exact from it a stable or a latest set of stable images that are going to resonate more deeply with people than if they just heard the dialogue. And meaning wave is sort of taking off in the corner of the internet that I move around in, where people are, talking about the meaning crisis and related thing. They're like, Akira the Dawn is doing it. And I forget the name of this one person who's been doing a bunch on my videos. He just released one taking a thing from Jonathan Pajot and mine about the internet as a monster. I forget your name. I think it's Chris, and I can't remember your name. I'm sorry. I apologize. But the internet is a monster. It's a meaning wave. And I was watching it. I was going, wow, this actually, there's continuity with the theoretical dialogue, because it's actually there. Jonathan's there. I'm there. But something else is happening, right? It's getting lifted off, like in that Zen fashion, where something's happening, where I don't know what to say. Something like there's salience landscaping going on top of the original dialogue in a way that is translating it outside of just the theoretical domain, because rhythm is introduced and sound and color, and so you're getting very much an aesthetic response layered on top of the dialogical.
It almost seems like a memification of dialogos or something, which
Yes.
when Layman, you talk about koans, it's like the notion of sort of a short, pithy, but philosophically and spiritually laden notion. Sort of it would be one way of thinking about how that might manifest in our kind of social media landscape, where you've got 150 characters, as it were, or you've got someone's attention for a little bit. And this isn't to say that spiritual development and growth is going to be playing out, as it were, like in your scroll, your feed scroll, but just to say that in the dispersal of these kinds of symbolic materials, that this would be a great way for sort of extracting from really philosophically rich and dense, broader contexts, whether that's a podcast context or an interview or some conversation, and extracting that and sort of sharing it, making it sort of mimetically propagated. And to think about the way that memes could work in that way. Historically, personally speaking, I've been very skeptical of these sorts of always trying to find ways of sort of matching spirituality to where technology is at any given moment. But at the same time, there's an inevitability about it and a necessity to it, it seems. And so if we are going to be working in this sort of, kind of diaspora online community context where these sorts of, practices are playing out, that would be a wonderful genre, I guess I'm saying, a kind of sacred genre that is both playful and aesthetic at the same time, but it carries a kind of profound message potentially, and is also an invitation to go further with it and to continually change and readapt and whatnot. That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I think it's, obviously you're not proposing that this would be the entire repository for religion in the future, because one of the really important things about religion is that it does maintain material and forms from previous epochs so that you have that contextualization of the moment that you're in, but it also has to take advantage of what's emerging in this moment, as happened in the great religious moments of history. And this idea of being able to do that sort of memification faster is really important to think about in terms of, evolving the ability to evolve, right? Because we've had decades of, I can listen to a dub version of a William Burroughs rant, or I got a trance version of a Terence McKenna thing, right? But that unfolds over decades. If we're talking about turning John Vervaeke into a song, or turning this dialogue into a song, that's a much faster turnover rate. Yeah. Right. So there's a potential ability to be adapting much faster, provided we also have some layered mechanism for upregulating certain components of that. So somebody's picking bits of a speech out and they're weaving it into a meaning wave. And then we also would like some other people who have some capacity to go, you know what, these ones came up a couple of times and we'd like to upregulate those for salience so that we're getting a clearer and clearer, smaller and smaller package of things with a broader capacity to both inculcate wisdom, but also to stimulate our shared imaginal.
Yeah, that's good, Layman. That's very good. I like that. I mean, we do, and one of the things we can exploit, I'm just thinking about your preservation of forms. I mean, this what we're using right now it's weird because it's got the spontaneity. It cuts across the divide in the Phaedrus, right? Because we've got the spontaneity of living encounter and speech, but we've got the permanency of writing in that it's recorded, and then people can do variations on it, but they can always go back to the original. So they've got the capacity to, flux out with the variation and then compress back towards the original, reinterpret the original from the variation. So you can even do that kind of dialectical practice right? Because you can, like I say, you can flux out, introduce it's almost like deep learning, and then you come back, recompress, and then reinterpret the original, go back out, and you could be doing this on an ongoing basis. And that way you'd have the preservation of the form, although you'd be doing a lot of evolution of the form, of the meaning of the form.
And that to me also weaves in, I think one of the things Layman brought up early on was the notion of trying to see the colloquial as a container of profound spiritual import, and not necessarily needing to go to, right, which is an example of that. But for me, everything that we're saying ties into the notion of canon in a fascinating way too. Yes. In the sense of, the notion that, these many instances have been done of this, but these ones are particularly kind of salient, and so we'll kind of make more use of those, and then these become kind of part of the popular familiarity with this sort of thing. And so basically the possibilities of canon emerge here, not as a top-down sort of hierarchical imposition, but as a bottom-up sort of, imbuing of significance, which is sort of entirely organic and really exciting. And this, I think what we're talking about is one possible application and component of that. But this, as an idea, I feel like, and trying to apply this idea in many different aesthetic forms is what is really exciting to me. And I feel like once you can start to see the potentials for doing this across different aesthetic fields, as it were, then you open up a whole new realm of co-creation, open source, engagement, which is also deeply rooted in people's current moment. And so it's deeply salient and deeply important in a way that maybe for some people a symbol from 2000 years ago isn't, or can maybe reincorporate and reimagine those symbols in these new contexts. So I'm super excited by all of that.
Yeah, canon is fascinating because in some ways, it's always bottom up. but it depends on what tempo is being involved and what technologies are being involved. So if you have a situation where you have a bunch of orally distributed diverse opinions about a religion, then those people have to get together and they have to debate. And at some point they go, all right, this is the one we're going to go with. And so we're putting it in the book. So it's a negotiation between the oral colloquial and the literary. But we have new technologies now that operate outside of that dichotomy. Right?
Yes.
We have the spontaneous and the literary and the digital. So they have to negotiate, and our ability to capture these bottom-up things is much faster. Right. So if you have canon, once you've established canon bottom up, essentially, you've captured it somehow and clarified it, then it seems like it's top down for a long time until that process happens again. But when you're using the digital tools, the bottom up updating of canon can happen much faster and much more often in a much more distributed fashion, which makes it resemble the patterns of distributed organic systems much more explicitly.
I was thinking of a resonance again, to just pick up on that, Layman. We you know, you have the mandala constructions in Tibetan Buddhism with the sand mandalas, and they're collectively made, and then they get destroyed, and you participate. We're kind of doing digital mandalas in that way. But what's neat is they both pass away and are preserved. Again, it cuts between those. So that is really, I'm picking up on Brendan's excitement. There's a lot of room for just new ways of doing art. It's kind of weird because it's art and engineering and also social leadership. Like, it's a bunch of different things together, which is really, really interesting. I mean, and it could actually be something, like I said, that people could plausibly train for, at least in an apprenticeship sense. So the people who have been good moderators, one of their tasks would be to, have a guild and keep training other good moderators and really explicate and appreciate this new kind of aesthetic we're talking about here. But I like that idea, of capitalizing on the novelty, the way the technology affords us to cross things that have typically been separated by very hard boundaries. I think that's really, really important, without just giving chaos, because that's not what happens. Because there are going to be preserved dialogues. There is going to be, a history of the variations and the recapitulations happening, and people can take out static images or static pieces. I think this is amazing. I think this is really, really a potential. And this, to me, is starting to feel the way the brain organizes itself, as opposed to, we're going to get sort of self-organizing criticality within a dynamic, not a hierarchy, a dynamic nesting of small world network for me. It's constantly going. So that, to me, is, that could even be a little bit theoretically clarified at some point, but that's the intuitive feel I'm getting. This is feeling like the way the brain works, as opposed to the way a dominance hierarchy works.
And that's what I was thinking. Sorry. Well, I was going to say, when we were talking about this before, and we were like, well, there's something like these institutions that might exist, referring to the monastery and the academy and whatnot. But the notion that these are going to be existing as regulators of integration that aren't necessarily, material structures, and the open possibility that these are going to be digital and taking advantage of all the kind of technological realities of our current moment. And then we talked about the sort of what was the phrase? The doing at the level of sort of distributed cognition, this sort of relevance realization, and using these technologies in this way would seem to be doing what you're saying. And I think that's basically what you're getting at, is saying this is how the brain works. It opens up a whole new field. I think it also, one of the big things that comes out for me a lot about all this is that, again, we've been stepping into this space, but these dynamics aren't fully solidified. And in some ways, I mean, over just the past 5 years, the internet has changed dramatically. And so I feel like that kind of time between worlds is what we're we're negotiating and navigating right now, because these digital architectures, these digital institutions are sort of quite literally coming online, as it were, in our current moment. And I would also, just maybe to throw this in there too, still fraught with, while they're not hierarchically sort of Iron Age structures, they are also still caught up in systems of, the whole global economic system that has allowed these technologies to persist. And so that brings in, I think, interesting components that need to be maybe considered as well. But anyway, I'm just to throw out that around this sort of complex of ideas, there's a number of really important areas that I feel like sort of are inviting exploration. Some of them probably won't be even apparent for some time to come yet, but still that they're there and emerging, and it opens up a number of possibilities.
I think we're in some very exciting areas here. I'm imagining a scenario where like a city has a generic church, a physical building, and different people can give sermons, and those sermons are recorded and digitally artified. And then subsets of those are upregulated almost as fast as the sermon is being given. And then just, the fascinating stuff. But a little bit to what Brendan was saying, it still has to be actually transformative. It has to really socially and psychologically transform people and make their lives better. So we're coming to the end. I'm being mindful of time here. I don't know how to quite name what this leap off spot is for our next discussion, but there's myth and mandala and the imaginal accelerated through new technologies and the potential training systems for moderator meaning DJs, something like that. I'm also, one of the things that's running through my head is my own set of what are the necessary practices that will make up the wisdom skills that need to be promulgated here. Maybe that's something, John, that you and I can talk about with Bruce when we have a discussion with him coming up. But other than that, I'm having a fantastic time, and we all seem to get sort of intuitively excited right at the end of our discussion here. Is there anything either of you want to say before we bring this to a close?
Just a procedural point. We'll pick this up perhaps on, I think it's my turn. Back on my channel, Voices with Vervaeke, and we'll continue this going. I'd like to take what we talked about very sort of somewhat abstractly and then concretize it the way Layman's suggesting next time. But other than that, just thank you, gentlemen. This has been amazing.
Yeah, this has been really wonderful. And this is the stuff that is just really excites me. So I'm really glad to be talking about it with minds like your own. I guess just on the topic maybe of concretization for next time, I'd be interested to see if there's any examples, if we kind of sit on it for a while, that we could kind of think about maybe what might be our first sort of foray into what would be a symbol that might help concretize a particular idea that's important to one of these ecologies or one of these practices and these ecologies of practices, and maybe see if we could even start to enact some of the things that we're talking about. Could be interesting. But anyway, more generally, this has been great, and thanks so much for doing this, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it.